Next up, we have live effects. So in most cases, the effects that we use in Illustrator alter the appearance of the object without actually changing the underlying artwork. So there are two different types of effects in Illustrator, and if we look here in the drop-down menu, we see we have Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects. Some exist in both, and some are exclusive to one or the other. Illustrator effects at the top half are vector effects. They can only be applied to vector objects or to the fill or stroke of a vector object. The bottom half are Photoshop effects or raster effects. They can be applied to either vectors or bitmaps. So if you're working with vector art at all and you can find what you need at the top half of the screen, stay up here in the effects. All right, we can apply these different effects different ways. The properties panel we've done before using this drop-down effect menu option, or using our appearance panel. We're going to do one version right away. So we're going to start with our selection tool, and we're going to click to select the handle of the paintbrush. Notice that it grabbed all of the paintbrush, and we see that it's grouped up here. So all of the different pieces have been grouped together. In our appearance panel at the bottom, we're going to click on the Add New Effect button, and we're going to choose from the top half, Stylize, and then Drop Shadow. This is going to pop up a Drop Shadow dialog box, and Multiply is the default behavior. That's fine. We're going to change the opacity to 50%. The offsets are 0.14. 0.14, and the blur is 0.21. If your preview is on, you'll be able to see the preview. Notice that this is being applied to the paintbrush as a whole, as a group, so it's staying on the perimeter. It's not just targeting these individual pieces. Say OK, and again, we applied that effect to the entire group, and we can see that in our panel up here. All right. The next thing we can do is we can edit effects. If we're not entirely happy with them, we can change our mind because they're live effects. We are going to click to select the object, the text object that says Art Show. And we're going to go up to our effect menu this time, and we're going to choose the very top option, which is replaying the last thing you did. So in our case, it's the last drop shadow we did, and it's going to literally apply those same details to it. So we can see that that has added a drop shadow, and it applied the same offset and blur that we have down here with the paintbrush. If we don't want it to be exactly that way, or we want to tweak the numbers, we can click on the words drop shadow over here in our appearance panel and get that window to pop back up. And here we can change it. So maybe for this one, we only want 10% opacity, and the offset is fine, but the blur we want to be 0.03. So you can see that that changes the way that blur looks. When we're happy with that, we just say, okay. We can also stylize text using warp effects. We did this back in chapter 9, but we can also do it here in our appearance panel. So with your selection tool, select the text object for Art Show, and come over into your appearance panel and make sure that none of these rows are highlighted. If they are, click down here in a blank spot to make sure nothing is highlighted. Now that we have the text object selected, we are targeting this top group, not the characters themselves. We're going to add a special effect. We're going to go to Warp, and we're going to choose Rise. Now from in here, you have options of all the different warping, the arcs, the shells. We chose Rise, and you also have ways of tweaking the amount of bend. We can also change the horizontal and vertical distortion. So what we want is a 15-degree bend and 0 and 0 horizontal and vertical distortion. When you're at that point, click OK. And notice up at the top here, affecting the type object itself, we have a warp rise. Sometimes it's easier now if we want to actually change the type. If we have a typo or a word is wrong, it's easier to not have it in this warped view. So a simple way of doing that is just simply turning off the eyeball. So temporarily taking off the warp, and then we can actually edit these words. So we're going to grab our type tool, and instead of having Art Show, we're going to have an Art Fest, all in capital letters. From here, we're going to switch to our selection tool. So you can either click on it up here or simply hit Escape. So from your type tool, Escape takes you to your selection tool and selects the text object itself. And we can see over here that Warp Rise is turned off. We can now turn it back on. So that's been applied again. Now that we change the words, it looks a little wonky, like there's maybe too much bend to it. So we want to edit that, so we just click on the effect over here, the Warp Rise, and we tweak it. And in this case, we're going to take it to maybe an 11% bend. That's going to look a little bit better. Say OK, and then I'm also going to just move it down a little bit so it centers it more on our banner. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to add some other effects. With our selection tool, we're going to choose the top banner to select it. Notice that we see we have a white fill with a 10-point stroke around the shape. And based on, I'm going to zoom in a little here, based on where I see my path line, it's centered. The 10-point stroke is centered 5 points inside, 5 points outside. We're going to first select the stroke attribute, and we're going to twirl it open to make sure that what we're doing is only affecting the stroke right now. So with our stroke row selected, we're going to go down to our bottom Add Effect button, and we're going to choose Path and then offset the path. The number that we type in here, I'll type in 2 to show you how extreme that is. That's not what I wanted to do. But what we want to type in here is negative 0.13 inches. And if you just hit Tab, that's going to show you a negative number moves it inward. If I didn't have that negative number here, you would see that it would move outside of the white shape. It offsets the stroke by this amount. So we want to have a negative number there so that it actually moves this inside and gives kind of an artsy border to this. All right. Finally, we're going to do something with one of those strokes that we had earlier that was a tealish blue color, and it's underneath this pattern with the white stroke. So with our selection tool, we're going to click to select Art Fest again. And down here in our character, we're going to select the stroke option. And again, twirl that open, because right now the opacity of this refers to just this stroke. It's kind of nested inside here. We want to do something to just this stroke and have another thing nested under here. With that expanded, we're going to come down and click on the FX button, and we're going to choose Distort and Transform, Transform. And we're going to get an option up here. So we have a 5-point stroke that's underneath here right now. We're going to transform it. We're going to move it 0.013 inches horizontally and 0.013 vertically. You can kind of start to see that light blue show up now underneath here. And then we're going to make 10 copies of that and hit Tab. That's going to make 10 offset copies of that stroke and move them each that far off of the other. So you can see it kind of gives us that 3D extruded type look. And when we're happy with that, we'll say OK. And notice that this transform is nested underneath. It's only affecting the stroke. So it's not affecting the characters as a whole or the type object as a whole. We can then deselect and do a File Save As, and we are good through page 375. And I had one previously that I had to overwrite.